Freedom is slavery. War is peace, ignorance is power. If we hear this word from somewhere in real life, either we don't take it seriously or we think that the person who says this has mental health problems. But these words in the book 1984 are written on the streets, buildings and radios in this universe, and this word is not even strange to the people there. Otherwise, there are situations of accepting this promise. George Orwell's famous book, which tells us about a dark world, is one of the best examples of the genre we call 1984 dystopias. Orwell, who is also a journalist, observed the ideologies such as communism, socialism and fascism that gained activity during his time very well and produced a gripping and thought-provoking story. And the fact that the book has such historical subtitles makes this work both realistic and so terrible. Even today, we can see an analogy of the creepy politics in this book. This book, which makes people nervous, scared, sad and most importantly question while reading, has a tremendous depth, and the subject of this video is the philosophy of the book 1984. The book begins by introducing us to a dystopia in which a one-party regime reigns and is governed by a dictatorial understanding. This party, which is in the government, is putting pressure on its people by every possible means imaginable. For example, by placing cameras that we call telescreens in buildings, streets or people's homes, they observe where they are doing and what they are doing every second. There are posters everywhere of a figure called Big Brother, who is said to be the head of the party, and under these posters, Big Brother is watching you, writing. Even in this regime, not only what people talk about, but even what they think is being scrutinized. This government has introduced a concept called thought crime. And this crime is designed to punish those who express thoughts contrary to the ideas of the government, and the current crimes are considered the most severe deck. It is also a language called new discourse in this dystopia. The tower is being used. In the new language of discourse, some words that the government does not want have been taken out of circulation. And the government publishes a dictionary for this language, and it is forbidden to use the words mentioned in the vocabulary in everyday life. Amid all this pressure, we meet our main character Winston. Deck. This character, a low-ranking member of the party, is now tired of this oppressive regime he is subjected to and has gradually begun to break the rules set for him by the government. In this process, we witness Winston secretly getting close to a woman named Julia, being trapped by a high-ranking O'Brien, and gradually losing his resistant spirit as a result of the betrayals he suffered. And the first part we should focus on in this book is the propaganda technique that this regime skillfully applies. There is a question that appears in our minds at the very beginning of the book. How come people here are not rebelling despite such an oppressive government? The fact that these people are not rebelling, even passionately joining the government's side, shows us that this government has successfully applied certain manipulation techniques. Then maybe it's necessary to ask this question, like, how do you get people on your side? One of the government's answers to this question is by making people hate the other side. The government organizes a ceremony called Hate Week every year. People gather here and spew their hatred against their enemies, specifically the front arm stick of the enemy side, like a ritual. At the same time, the government also announces its new enemies at this event. It's not just about that, either. There is also a daily routine called 2 Minutes of Hate. At this event, people show their love for Big Brother in addition to spewing hatred at their current enemies. And at these events, even someone like Winston, who does not support and does not hate the government, cannot stop himself from accompanying this action because of herd psychology. In the book, he explains this situation as follows. The terrible thing about 2 Minutes of Hate was not that someone had to pretend, but that it was impossible to avoid participating. Any number within 30 seconds was always superfluous. A disgusting enthusiasm of fear and hatred, a desire to kill, torture, crush faces with a sledgehammer flows through the entire human community like an electric current. It seemed to turn someone into grimacing, screaming against their will. Although these traders of hate mentioned in the book may seem a little unusual at first, this kind of hate speech targeting the enemy is a method that leaders often resort to. Let's examine the policy of the Soviet Union, which inspired Forvalind to write this book. Joseph Stalin, who was leading this union for a period, reveals a crime called the enemy of the people. Stalin, who declared people who opposed the regime he imposed as enemies of the people and sent them to concentration camps. By this method created the understanding that there are enemies even among us in the people and created a section where they can direct their hatred and anger at them, since he can create the perception of an enemy even in the minds of people who are not strict supporters of him. These people are the enemy of my enemy. Going back to the book, we can say that this government is pursuing a policy of hatred and hostility similar to Stalin, as well as conducting strong propaganda in other respects. In the history of the sociologist William Bitlell in 1931, about 17 years before the writing of this book, he published an article on the psychology of propaganda. And in this article he lists the 4 items necessary for a perfect propaganda. These substances are as follows. 1. Put emotions first, don't get into an argument. 2. Put the propaganda in the mold of us, and the opposite side is the enemy. 3. Reach out to groups as well as individuals. And 4. Hide the propagandist as much as possible. If we go back to the universe of 1984, we will see that the party skillfully uses these substances when making propaganda. Let's take the first item. By highlighting emotions and not getting into the discussion, we can see that the government is completely targeting the feelings of people there during Hate Week or 2-minute hate presentations. Why is the other side in the presentations our enemy? Arguments such as why we are the good side or what we are fighting for are hardly presented. Instead, an enthusiastic music is given at the back. A presentation is made in which emotions come to the fore, accompanied by chants. The purpose of the presentation is to get people excited rather than telling them an idea. Put the propaganda, which is the second item, into the mold of us, and let's focus on the enemy item on the other side. This government always has an enemy and is in a war. In fact, this government has to be in a war to have an enemy to keep the people on its side. He knows that if you deprive this people of war and the enemy, the anger and hatred that the people have suppressed will come to them in turn. Therefore, always fighting with an enemy, we are always one and enemies are being distinguished. We see that reaching out to groups as well as individuals, which is the third article, has been successfully implemented. Hate Week or 2-minute hate events take place in public. And if these presentations had been made in an individual way, rather than in groups, for example, if Winston had been alone at these events, it would have been much more difficult for him to express his hatred. But as I mentioned, although Winston does not support the government's policy, he gets caught up in a lot of psychology in these mass hate events and can't stop himself from participating in hate. Hide the propagandist, the fourth item, as much as possible. We can also say that he applied his part expertly. The name of the head of the government is a mysterious person called Big Brother. And although this person is the leader of the party and the name behind the propaganda, he does not appear in any way throughout the long story. He only exists on posters and screens. It is not seen in humans in any way. It's hidden as much as possible. And if we examine the propaganda applied by this party from beginning to end, we will see that they have a very effective method. But this propaganda technique still cannot ensure that characters like Winston literally join the ranks of the party. And the party is playing different trump cards here. As I mentioned, there is a concept called thought crime in this government. If a person has anti-government ideas and expresses these ideas, he is severely punished. But the government has a much more cunning method than thought crime, which is to reduce the public's capacity to think. I mean, not even allowing him to commit a thought crime. And they do it with language. It is forbidden to use some words that the party finds inappropriate in the new discourse, the language that the government has made available to its people, and we can see that this policy is extremely functional. When we look at the language we use and the words that language has, it has a critical value for our thoughts. Because when a person transfers a thought to another person, even when he establishes a thought in his own mind, he formulates this idea with words. But if it is forbidden to use words to express that idea, it will be so difficult for it to take place in the human mind in that idea. Since the government knows this situation, by banning these words, it prevents people not only from expressing anti-government ideas, but also from even forming these ideas. For example, to give an example, let's take the word dictator. And let's imagine that the word dictator has been removed from the new discourse dictionary, even other words that can replace this word. In this case, even if a person can hold the idea that Big Brother is a dictator in his mind, he will not be able to express it to other people. Because he will not be able to use the words he needs, and even the person who wants to establish this word will gradually forget what the word dictator means. It will become increasingly difficult to even form such an idea in his mind. One of the other methods that the government applies to control people's minds is past manipulation. This government distorts information from the past, changes it according to its own interests, and kind of rewrites information from history. They make the situation before the current regime look like a disaster and thus enable the people to be grateful to the current regime. They create imaginary people and show them like a hero and show how strong a history they have. In fact, Winston feels that by forcing his memory, the party is distorting information from the past. But since the government has eliminated all kinds of documents and photos related to the past, Winston is skeptical even about his own memory. The party's ability to shape the past the way it wants is one of its strongest trumps in controlling the people. Because this party, which controls the past, can justify all its current actions, designs the past in such a way that it can convince its people that the current regime's oppression and cruelty are a necessity or even a blessing compared to the past. But perhaps the most famous of these mind control methods of the government is the metaphor of 2 + 2 = 5, which is often mentioned in the book. When he seizes and tries to brainwash her, he tries to convince her that 2 + 2 is 5, or rather, 2 + 2 is whatever the government wants, where the organ did not just choose the equation 2 + 2 = 5. This equation has a metaphorical value. For example, the Soviet Union aims to carry out its 5-year development plan in 4 years and chooses this equation as their slogan. But the real reference in this equation is to the mentality of the Nazis. He has a famous phrase that he said to express his loyalty to Adolf Hitler, who led the Nazi army. If our leader wants it that way, 2 + 2 makes 5, and Orwell writes the following in an article he prepared before this book about the Nazis manipulating this kind of truth. Nazi theory indeed flatly denies that there is such a thing as truth. The implied goal of this line of thought is a nightmare world in which the leader or some managers control not only the future, but the past. If the leader says that it didn't actually happen for any event, well, that event never happened. If it is said that 2 + 2 is 5, then 2 + 2 is 5. This possibility scares me much more than bombs. If we gather what I have told so far, this government in the book is successfully applying 2 basic methods to brainwash the people. One of them is the propaganda technique that inculcates hatred and hostility, and the other is the mind control that they dictate through methods such as new discourse and past manipulation. But no matter how hard the government tries, it still can't succeed in attracting someone like Winston to its ranks to disrupt. And this time he resorts to a primitive, brutal and not so effective method, the fear factor. There is a concept that inspired the idea of monitoring people with wire screens that George Orwell designed in this book. Philosopher Jeremy Bentham designs a concept called to keep prisoners in prison under control. In this design, the prisoner cells are positioned in a circular manner. And in the center of this circle there is a lookout hut. And this officer can see what every prisoner around him is doing. According to this design, prisoners will think about the possibility that they can be monitored at any time and thus improve their movements. Although it is impossible for an officer to monitor all prisoners at the same time, even the worry in the prisoners' minds that the officer is watching me right now will make them hesitate to make a wrong move. This kind of monitoring mechanism is also implemented by the government in the book with the wire screens it puts everywhere. Although it is not possible for all people to be monitored by telegrammers at the same time, as in the prison example, I wonder if I am being monitored. Even paranoia prevents people from making anti-government movements. Even the government has taken the telegram logic to an even further level, and he has turned people into walking wire screens. In other words, even people observe other people like a telescreen and complain about them when they sense an anti-government impression. Especially in the Soviet Union under Stalin, this situation is observed exactly the same. Stalin encourages his citizens to expose them without mercy when they see someone anti-government around them. In fact, this tradition reaches such a level that a friendly neighbor of people, even a family member, has become able to expose his anti-government relative without any pity. When we look at the book by book, we see a similar situation in the character of Parsons. The person who complained to the government of Pars, who turned out to have committed a thought crime, is his own daughter. If we come back, the person who made him fall into the hands of the government is his character, who helped him get a room and gave him a reliable image at first. And with the capture of Winston, we also get an introduction to the most difficult part of this story. Uberian tries to make Winston love Big Brother by torturing and manipulating him and making him believe that 2 + 2 is 5, or rather, the number the party wants. Winston finally admits that he can't stand his suffering and accepts what Uber said, but he realizes that Uber still can't break Winston's resistant spirit and decides to put him in the famous torture chamber number 100. When Winston finds out that rats are going to gnaw on his face here, his real heartbreak happens. Here, O'Brien states that this torture will be done either to Winston himself or to Julia, with whom he is having an affair. Winston gives up on this part and agrees to be tortured instead of himself. And thus, the truth of the following statement about suffering in the book is registered. You can only wish for one thing from pain, to make it stop. Nothing in the world is as bad as physical pain. There is no hero in the face of the pilgrim. And the government has managed to get Winston into the state they want at the end of all this work. Winston has started to feel like he belongs to this government now. Instead of the hatred he maintained against Big Brother, he eventually received love, and now it has become 2 + 2 5 for him. Exactly what 1984 criticizes is exactly what criticism of socialism, criticism of communism, criticism of fascism actually. This book is essentially a criticism of a totalitarian regime. If any ideology, whether communism or fascism, has turned into a repressive state that prevents rights and freedoms in practice, it puts the people in such a situation that they do not even realize that the people's mind is being controlled and that they have lost their freedom of thought. Here, the book 1984 is a warning against the danger that if we allow such a regime to gain power, we will enter an irreversible path again. But when we look at the end of the book 1984, can we say that Irvin finished the book pessimistically? When we look at it from one point of view, we see that he has lost and that the government can transform him into the person it wants. But as a result of spending all the resources at their disposal, the government was only able to make Winston what they wanted. Winston was watched by wire screens, spent hours with Ubrian, one of the smartest members of the party, and the torture chamber number 100,000, which was the last resort, was only able to disrupt him, and the government made a lot of effort to assimilate when we looked at it. All this effort and resources that the government spends on converting just one person would be insufficient if there were more people like Nissen, and we can infer from this that if the number of people who are not afraid to think and question like Winston were a little more, then this government would understand that 2 + 2 is 4, and they can't afford to change it either.